Okay, is everybody ready for building a development environment out of your production environment? Yay! Well, we've got a small room, but hopefully, or a far too large room. I mean, who knows? It's like the cloud. It seems to have infinite capacity. So, today we're going to be talking about building a development environment out of a production environment. My name's Orin Thomas. And I am, well, I'll talk about a bit more what I am in a second. But I found this wonderful quote on the internet. Everybody in the world has a testing environment. And some people are lucky enough to have a totally separate environment in which to run production. So the genesis of this talk involves the fact that, as I said, my name's Orin Thomas and I'm an IT pro. And one of the things that's very interesting about the cloud, and one of the things I found very interesting about my own experience in being an IT pro and talking to people about the cloud, is the fact that I go into organisations and they have a whole lot of what I'd call idiosyncrasies to the way that they approach traditional IT pro topics. And that's sort of what the genesis of this talk is. But you'll understand that as we get further into it. So, yin and yang, night and day, Kirk and Spock, developer and IT pro. Now you'll notice the way that I've framed that. The developers are Kirk. The IT pros, possibly more Spock. Captain, you should not do that. I'm going to do it. Okay, so again, this is a very how an IT pro might think, and maybe I am exaggerating certain things to get laughs, because I'm kind of known to do that, and that's sort of the point of this. If we're going to talk about important topics, sometimes it's better to frame it in a humorous little way of doing it. Maybe my jokes will die, but at least then you get your revenge by putting the nice "Orange jokes died" leaflet into the evaluation bin. Okay, so one of the things that's always been very clear to me, and I started off in computer science as a developer before I went into IT pro, was this idea that developers and IT pros think differently. And it's really not that you're trained differently, it's just that the archetypical developer and the archetypical IT pro have different mindsets. They've got different personalities, they've got different ways of viewing the world. Developers are generally optimists. IT pros are generally pessimists. Developers often feel that they don't need test environments because they're reasonably convinced that the code that they're about to deploy is going to work. IT pros really want test environments because they're absolutely convinced that the code that the developers are going to deploy isn't going to work. So again, optimists, pessimists, different ways of thinking about this. IT pros lay awake at night wondering, did that backup complete successfully? Developers wonder about the existence of backup when something goes spectacularly pear-shaped. Again, a different approach. Oh, come on, that was worth a laugh. Throw a man a banana. I love this one. Worked fine in dev, ops problem now. Like Voltron, however, developers and IT pros are more effective together than they are separately. We've got two different things. I got a Voltron reference in as well. Everybody here knows who Voltron is? How many lines in Voltron? 5 lines, right. Which is the best line? Black line? Oh, kind of like blue, but you know. Now, the genesis of this talk is this idea that many born in the cloud organisations don't have traditional IT processes, and importantly, increasingly don't have IT pros on staff. In fact, within the IT pro community, there's this great fear that we're irrelevant, that we're no longer needed, and that the cloud obviates the need for our existence. And you see that sometimes in the messaging from Microsoft. Microsoft has a very dev-focused messaging, certainly in the last few years, and you haven't even heard mention of IT pros. And IT pros' response to this is like, what? Wait, where are we? We're not in here. And a lot of organisations that are born in the cloud, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, don't have IT pros. It's very interesting then coming into those organisations as an IT pro and looking at what they've done. And that's, again, part of the genesis of this talk. And without IT pros, with the boundless optimism of only having developers, it means that they're not building pessimism into their processes. Healthy information systems require input from groups of people who have separate and distinct mindsets. If you're going to have long-term stability, you need both optimist and pessimist in the way that you're building out systems. Healthy information systems require pessimists as much as they require optimists. If you just have pessimists, nothing gets done. If you just have optimists, everything's unicorns and fairies until something goes wrong. So you have to have people that approach this in different ways. So the desire for a dev test environment is an inherently pessimistic one. And this is one of the reasons that a lot of organisations don't have them, especially born in the cloud organisations. So this is framing the idea of part of my criticism of Azure. And this slide is even funnier when you consider the following statistic. The average age of an IT pro is 43. There is not a lot of young IT pros coming into the system. The average age of a developer is 25. So it really is old man yells at cloud when it comes to IT pros and the cloud. Because IT pros, and there's an even more disturbing statistic, in the US, the average age of IT pros in government is 60. So it's a lot of old men with beards, usually old men, sometimes old women, but older people, and then the young, hot developers. You go and look at the Microsoft marketing about developers, and you're not seeing a sort of lot of people look like fat old bald guys like me. You're seeing lots of hip, excellent people. You go out and look at all of the pictures out on the marketing there, you know, and IT pros kind of know that. They kind of go, yeah, we're everybody's kind of boring dad. Well, that's the way it works, right? So, one of the interesting things about the cloud is that it both enables us, but, and you don't necessarily realise this unless you think about it, it also infantilises us. What do I mean by that? Enables us, that's good. Infantilises us, that doesn't sound so good. Well, enables. Everything for the cloud is simple and easy, and the cloud provider takes care of it for you. It changes your nappy. It does everything you want. All you with the cloud, it's just your dreams are out there and you are executing them. But that same thing infantilises us because everything is simple and easy. And the cloud provider takes care of it for you. And when someone takes care of everything for you, suddenly you don't necessarily know how anything works. It's like, for example, people that always drive automatic cars being suddenly put into a manual. Now, there's an existential question as to whether or not that matters, but it's something to consider. The cloud providers are making it very easy. It's like, come in, run your workloads on us. We will make it absolutely simple for you. But there's always a catch, isn't there? Because if you do come in, you do run your workloads, and you don't understand what's going on underneath, then you start to have challenges if you change your mind. So there's quite a lot, for example, that Azure, and I'm talking about Azure because I'm mostly a Microsoft person, but this applies to other cloud providers as well. There's quite a lot that it doesn't do for you. But you won't realise it until you read the fine print. And this is what I find when I go and talk to companies. I'll go and go, have you thought about this? I thought the cloud provider did that. No, they don't. In fact, there was a stat that by 2020, 97% of all security breaches in the cloud will be because of custom misconfigurations. So the cloud provider's saying, well, we've done it all right, but you've got to realise that there's a whole lot of stuff you do. One of the easiest things to do, there's a thing called Azure Security Center. If you're a consultant on the cloud and you're going into an organisation, you can run Azure Security Center for free against a subscription. And it'll go through and give you a list of all of the security misconfigurations. People spinning up IaaS VMs and then never patching them. People not turning on next generation firewalls. People not configuring network security groups. Because what happens is people don't necessarily realise that they have to do this because it's all been made easy. It's all been go out and deploy. It's really easy. You don't need to think about it. Just go and deploy. Get your stuff out there. But there's a lot more to IT than just deployment. Azure is endlessly and increasingly complicated. New features are appearing all of the time. I mean, if you're watching Scott Guthrie's Twitter feed, he's talking about, oh, we've got this. And then like a day later, we've got this. We've got this. We've got this. We've got this. That's great, except for who can keep up with this, this, and this? Who knows how to configure this? And what is your automatic response when someone gives you a new feature? You want to take it for a spin, don't you? Now, you want to take something for a spin that you don't really understand. That's good, but it can also have consequences later on. Existing features of Azure disappear or transmogrify seemingly without warning. Again, if you're following all the right blogs, you know when stuff is being deprecated. But if you're not paying insane amounts of attention to the right people, you can find that features that you rely on get changed. Oh, we're moving from the classic portal to the new portal. Here's a wonderful thing I've found when I've gone and talked to a lot of organisations. Which portal are they still using? Who's still using classic portal for most things? Okay, none of you are. That's excellent, great. Vast majority of people I see still open up that portal first and only go to the new Azure portal when they can't figure out how to do it the old way. That is because people figure out how to do something the old way, and once they've figured that out, they don't learn how to do it the new way because they can still do it the old way. It's only when the old way gets completely taken away that they bother learning how to do it the new way. We don't understand what we don't understand. This is a quote that's sort of butchered from Donald Rumsfeld, and it really applies to the cloud. There is too much to know about the cloud. There is too much there. We can't understand what we don't understand. How can we configure an app to run properly? How can we configure anything to run properly when we don't understand all of the complexities of that? And should we have to? Should a developer have to understand all of those exigencies about something? Or is it, again, as I've suggested, that if you have an IT pro mindset, that's the person that should worry about it, and the IT pro should be enabling the developer to do what the developer does, and the IT pro worrying about all of those exigencies. And that's why I argue when I'm talking to IT pros about this, I say you do have a role in the cloud. You have to sit there and worry about things like compliance. You have to worry about security. You have to worry about, is data being backed up, and all of those things that a lot of other people, a lot of developers won't be thinking about because they're concentrating on a lot of other complex stuff that's within their lane. We're so pressured, and this applies to both sides, so pressured to make it work that we can't be sure that it works reliably or securely. And here's a difference. Again, for developers, it's about, at least this is my perspective as a misguided old IT pro. For developers, it's about getting it there and making it work. If it's working, absolutely great. Does it work? Yep. Does it pass its tests? Yep. We're good. On the other side, you've got IT pros. Is it working reliably? Does it crash after 72 hours? One of the first things I got when I moved out of university IT into working in private enterprises is there's this wonderful app that every 35 days had enough of a memory leak that would actually crash the server. And then the server needed to be rebooted. Now, the person that deployed it didn't care about that because they weren't thinking 35 days out. But it became my problem to figure out why this server was crashing every 35 days, and then none of the transactions that were meant to be processed by the server were happening. And then I just went, there's this very small memory leak that you could see when you looked at it in that perspective. And again, it was that difference of approach. One was, this works, it's doing what it's meant to do. The other is, does it work over, very long timescales? It's a very different way of thinking about something. Now, here's another claim of mine, that cloud deprecates process. Now, what does that mean? And that's a big claim to make. Well, the majority of today's startups are born in the cloud. We know that. If there's some great books you can read. One of them I recommend is Chaos Monkeys. Chaos Monkeys is about a firm that's eventually acquired by Twitter and by Facebook, but it gives the guy who writes it, it's not a person you'd probably ever want to be a friend with. He's abrasive, he's full of himself, all of that. But the stuff he describes about the way that startups work in Silicon Valley today is mind-blowing. And we're not talking about the nice Mike Judge way of sort of showing goofy people in Silicon Valley. We're talking about the brutal, it's all about the money type of Silicon Valley. That's probably a far more realistic approach to it. But born in the cloud organisation. Why? Because why do you get born in the cloud? Well, you don't need a garage to host your infrastructure. You don't need to have any servers when you're setting up your startup. You just need a trial subscription to the public cloud. All you need is a trial subscription. You can sign up for one of those for free. So you've got an idea, let's sign up for a trial subscription. All you need is an idea, some code, and the cloud provider, that great mother in the sky, looks after the rest for you. You don't need to go and buy a server, you don't need to go and buy all of that equipment, you should just go spin it up off your laptop. When you're starting out from scratch, the cloud is almost a completely blank canvas. And this comes to one of my other analogies about the difference between IT pros and devs. That developers are more like artists. And of course, IT pros are like art critics. But it's that act of creation that artists are, the developers are inherently creative people, that they need to create. And my brother is an artist, my brother's a sculptor. And he goes and creates these amazing statues. And in Melbourne, he did one that was a gigantic shipwreck on the shore of St Kilda. And I think up here he did one that was like a cross between a submarine and a whale that was put on one of the Sydney beaches. But he has a very different temperament to me. And again, this is how I view the world, because I'm a bit more conservative and worried about systems, and he's worried about going out and creating things. And to an extent, many of the developers I've known have had that creative impulse. And when you're creative, the beauty of the cloud is you don't need to worry about purchasing servers or slowly ramping up capacity. The cloud provider gives you as an artist, as a developer, the ability to access all the resource that you could possibly want in pursuit of your creation. The developer as an artist has the perfect canvas upon which to create. And this is how, to a certain extent, the cloud is sold to developers. It's take your idea and go with it. You can build out infrastructure as fast as you need. You can build out your idea as quickly as you need. You don't have to sit there and purchase a $30,000 server and then hook up the internet to it and do this and do that. You can just go with your idea and run with it. So why do born in the cloud organisations have poor IT processes? Rapid growth often comes at the expense of structured and careful planning. Again, if you are mired in that process of creation, you're not necessarily sitting there thinking, how do I build this in a very structured and logical way? It's like, no, it needs this. Oh, no, that's not working. I need to do this. Now it needs this. And someone comes, oh, it needs this feature, or you need to go and change this. So it's a much more organic process. By its nature, the cloud encourages organic, iterative development processes rather than structured, monolithic development processes. In the old days, when you had to go and plan out all your infrastructure, there was much more of a push-on process. It was, well, if we're going to go and buy this $30,000 server, you need to know what you're doing. You need to have all of this ready. We need to know when you need to have it. We need to go and spend all of this money. If you're sitting there and you can go throw your idea up in the cloud and then iterate it and grow it and grow it and iterate it, it's a much more organic process, and you're not sitting there trying to approve something or justify it to anybody. You're just moving and you're creating. It's challenging and if not impossible, and this is one of the challenges of this organic process, to bolt on security and process to something that has evolved organically. So there's an old story about the change between Windows XP and Windows Vista. Now we know that Windows Vista was never particularly popular, right? But the change was that if you looked at the Windows XP codebase, the Windows XP codebase was going all of the way back to the Windows NT codebase. And that had evolved organically. And then suddenly Microsoft realised that they needed to get a much better security story going. And their much better security story had them realise that when they looked at the code base, they couldn't make it secure by retrofitting it. They really needed to start from the beginning with security in mind. And this applies quite often to, unless you are absolutely brilliant, and I'm sure we all are, to the development of any application or any system. You've got to design it to be secure from the start. You can't sort of design it, build it out, and then go, let's bolt the security on now. So giving the developer as an artist a blank canvas in the form of, in Microsoft's case, a 150K extended trial subscription is also a deliberate strategy. There is method to this madness. I call it the Hotel California charity. Hotel California is you check in, but you don't really check out. That if you're given all of these resources, you get so intertwined with Azure that you become so dependent on Azure that by the time that trial subscription runs out, you're addicted, okay? Your first hit's for free. We're going to give you 150K of spend. Why? Because if we give you that much, you've got so much of a hit that you're probably not going to wander over the street to Amazon and start running your load there. When you're in an active creation, again, I'm probably way overselling this, but I'm trying to get, sometimes it's useful to use stereotypes to sort of perhaps over-exaggerate an idea. When you're in that active creation, you're spinning up your idea, you rarely have time to get security, redundancy, economics, and data protection right. Why? Because you are trying to get that proof of concept to the point where you can go and present it to investors or present it to someone who can allow you to take the next step. You're not sitting there going, well, I've got this really great idea for an app, but the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure the security's perfect. It's got all of these bits and pieces. It's like, no, gosh, I'm going to create it. I'm going to have my proof of concept there. It's going to be there. People are going to see it, and then I'll come back and I'll do all that other stuff I need to do. Because there's no initial need for restraint, especially when you've got like $150,000 worth of spend. Workloads are not deployed in the most efficient, secure, or recoverable manner. It's also always worth going when you're looking at someone else's cloud subscription for what I call orphaned craft. Workloads that are sitting there that are not doing anything. They're dead ends, that they go and create a database, or they go and create a VM, or they go and create something that's no longer being used. But because they've got in the habit of, well, we're not paying for this anyway, they don't go and remove this from the cloud subscription. So suddenly, when the billing turns itself on, they're sitting there going, wow, what are we paying for? And if you go through it, well, you're not using that, you're not using that, you can delete that, you can delete that, you can delete that. But sometimes it's not even documented. What does it do? Well, I don't know. Because the other guy who was here, who's no longer here, created it. Well, is it part of your app, or do you not need it? You hurtle into a substantial monthly bill when you come off your BizSpark subscription. Again, this is something I see a lot, where organisations that have been on BizSpark come off BizSpark, and then it's like, 30,000 bucks a month? Are you joking? No. Well, now we've got to start rationalising, right? Now, if you'd had more time to deal with it, or if you hadn't been pushing to hit whatever goal you were trying to hit, because again, this is what I'm trying to get across in this talk. With IT pros and developers working together, you've got someone who's sitting there, the boring IT pro sitting beside you in the car as you're the rally driver, going, okay, you need to turn left here, turn left, hurry up, turn left. Okay, good. Yes, we did that. We're still alive. Excellent. Let's keep going. For most born in the cloud organisations, workloads are deployed directly to production from inception. When you're starting out with just an idea, you avoid processes that get in the way of expressing that idea. And a formal deployment process does get in the way of expressing your idea. If you're sitting there trying to iterate all the time and you've got to go through this immensely boring and complicated test process before it gets out there, of course you're going to avoid that. Why? Because you're not at the stage where you're sure that this is going to lead to anything. Why am I going to go and put process in place when I'm not sure that this is actually going to lead to anything? Is this just going to waste my time? And everybody hates bureaucracy. There's a big reason why so many born in the cloud organisations lack a separate test environment. Process gets in the way of initial creative acts. Process is also driven by resource limitation. If you were on-prem 20 years ago and you had to go and spec out whether or not you needed that $30,000 server, you had a whole lot of processes to determine what you needed. Do we need a $30,000 server? Do we need a $25,000? Can we get away with a $20,000 service? Whereas if it's all you're sitting on a BizSpark subscription, you don't care because you can just go whoosh and it's there. The amount of people that spin up VMs that have got 12 cores and 64 gig of RAM, why do you do that? Because I can. It's really cool. And I'm not paying for it. It's a great VM. And if you've got a VM like that, don't bloody put a BitTorrent client on it. People eventually do notice. If there's no perceived resource limitation, there is no process. Or often there is not process. The perception that process is the grumpy blocker of developer frivolity. Okay, who here loves process? Who here hates process? Okay, it's sad that one of you put up your hand for liking process, but the other ones who didn't like process kind of went, you should hate process. You know, you want to tear down the statues. You want to revolutionise the world. You want to disrupt everything. We're disruptors. We just really like process. That would have got a laugh in a bigger room. Many born in the cloud startups transitions from prototyping some interesting ideas to suddenly having a whole business running off with what was once an ad hoc process of creation. Who has ever run into anybody who is sitting there and they've got a business and there's people that are and they're sort of sitting there a bit shell-shocked going, it's just an idea I had. It's not ready. It's, it might be ready in a couple of years. No. We need to go and show this to investors now. Okay. Who's done that? Anybody? Anybody know anybody like that? Anybody? Bueller? Come on. Some hands going up. Some smiles in the room. We're almost getting there. So without process, you're figuring out how to build wings and teaching yourself how to fly only after you've leapt off the cliff. This is one of those things that you hear about some Silicon Valley firms, that they learn to fly on the way down off the cliff. It's not really how you should do it, because often you end up like Wile E. Coyote from the Roadrunner cartoon as a big flat splat on the ground. Who's ever worked on a project where things have gotten so convoluted that everybody wants to start over from scratch? Anybody in the room? Right. The desire to start over from scratch is a response to the inevitable chaotic over-complexity of organic development. Traditional developer and IT models balanced that organic act of creation with a need for overall structure. And one of the claims, and one of the things, again, I haven't researched enough to prove it, is that this born in the cloud type set of methodologies that have developed really pushes things towards organic development. It pushes things towards rapid iteration. And rapid iteration is certainly great at a certain phase of the development process. But in terms of necessarily getting the right structure of whatever you're building out in the beginning, it depends on how organised your organisation is to how well that works. And the cloud somewhat sidesteps these models by providing the illusion to you that you have a limitless number of resources. Why do you need good process? Why does your code have to be efficient? If you can just keep throwing more processor at it, it'll get there. It's like we're sitting here with machines that are far more powerful than in our pockets than the ones that actually landed us on the moon. And it's very interesting to decide, well, why have we got to the stage where we are in our pockets carrying these supercomputers around from the 50 years ago, but are we necessarily accomplishing a whole lot more? Yes and no, but with the cloud providing that infinite capacity, and this is the other thing, right? Microsoft's not running a charity and neither is Amazon. Are they really going to encourage you to write efficient code that's going to allow them to charge you less? Or are they kind of like, you write the code you want, you don't need to be all that efficient, and if you're paying a lot more money, well, good on you. Microsoft's not running Azure, and Amazon's not running AWS. Microsoft especially, right? Big on-prem IT business. They're not going, let's get into that cloud thing because we want to make less money than we were making with on-prem. They're sitting there going, let's get into this cloud because we can really make some serious cash here. Like we made money on-prem. Let's get into the cloud because we'll make a lot more money, okay? Just remember, they're not charities. They've worked out all of this, and even though they say it's cheaper to run it in the cloud, there's an asterisk there. And that asterisk is, well, if you turn it off when you're not using it, if you've absolutely got it right-sized, and you're thinking about all of these sort of caveats that go on. The reality is most organisations are probably going to spend more money running things in the cloud than less, because unless they're really sitting down there and tightening the screws. It's sort of, if you've ever earned more money and then you're sort of sitting there going, wow, 10 years ago I was earning half of what I'm earning today, but I seem to actually have less money. It's the same thing. Capacity always expands to reach its available limit. So why else might organisations that are born in the cloud end up with without robust dev test environments? It was an experimental conceptual workload and we didn't expect anyone to actually use it. Anybody been in that boat? Tell me if you've heard this before. It's on our roadmap document. We've been okay so far, and you're looking around for wood to touch. The CEO has the attention span of a kitten on PCP and has 41,293 things in the queue that they want to deal with before we implement a dev test environment, because each one of those 41,293 things might impact the customer, and the CEO isn't actually sure that having a dev test environment actually does. So why do we need a test environment? Okay, has anybody in this room ever deployed something and then gone, oops? Okay, we're honest, that's good. Even when I was doing computer science at Melbourne University, oops was a pretty big part of my C code. Who's ever spent more time cleaning up a mess than they spent making it? Ask my 14-year-old about that. In fact, the amount of time he theoretically spends cleaning up a mess is probably infinite because it never gets cleaned up. Here's a hint for anybody who's got a teenager. Wi-Fi address MAC filtering. Figure out the MAC address of every device they own and then just go and selectively block those devices. That way you're not denying yourself Wi-Fi, but your teen's walking around like, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? What do I need to do? Dishes, rubbish, room. Okay. Like pocket money doesn't work. Wi-Fi blocking does. Dev test gives you a security bastion where another set of eyes can easily perform a sanity check before a workload goes into production. And this is important. Dev test gives you a rigorous location against which you can run extensive automated tests. So think about your automated testing environment. And this is one of the other things that I'll get to. Is it a good environment in which to run those automated tests? Or are your automated tests just a CYA scenario where, run some automated tests, we're good, deploy? Being able to recover quickly from a failed deployment is awesome, but it's no substitute for a good test environment. Now, why is that? Because that seems to be the, especially when I talk to some people that are very hardcore into DevOps, that seems to be their thing. They're like, it doesn't matter about this. You have, once it's handed over, because if you can roll back, you're golden, right? Well, that's good. I like being able to roll back. It's excellent. Because we will just recover if it goes pear-shaped. Only works if you've got a really good rollback process and your backups work. Backups exist in potentia. You never know if a backup has worked until you have to perform a restore. And this is something that people forget, especially people who have not been bitten by the, oh, I performed a restore and it didn't work thing. Another interesting stat. In 2000, before Microsoft developed System Center Data Protection Manager, they found that 23% of all restore operations that were done by Microsoft IT on Microsoft data using approved vendor solutions failed. So Microsoft IT knew how to do backups, but they were still getting a 23% failure rate on restore operations, simply because things like tapes were failing or the backup software wasn't working as advertised. And that's why they came out with Data Protection Manager. Now, we've since had other companies like Veeam come along and have improved things, but the reality is that most people you don't know if a backup's worked until you've tried to recover the data. So one of those things that you should regularly do is a recovery drill, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Who heard what happened to GitLab? 6 different forms of data protection, and when something went pear-shaped, they couldn't bring it back. Why? Because they'd never actually gone out and tested whether or not they could recover when things went absolutely wrong. So this is something that you need to think about. There's more to test than it works on my laptop. Who's ever heard that one before? Test looks enough like production that problems that we haven't foreseen, become apparent before they have a broader impact. The best test environments are indistinguishable from production. Now, there's obviously some problems with that statement, and there's some caveats to that statement, and we'll get to them. But let's talk a bit more about backup. Here's a question for you. If your Azure subscription was deleted tomorrow, that something happened and your subscription was gone, how long would it take you to rebuild? Have you thought about this question? Can you even answer it? Do you even know where to start? Would you be able to rebuild? Who here, if their Azure subscription went tomorrow, reckons they'd be able to rebuild their environment? Okay, so 2 of you. If your Azure configuration was hosed, so something became corrupted, so you've still got your subscription, but all of the configuration of the apps and everything that's running on it and the connection screens, there's just some form of weird corruption, got hosed, would you be able to recover? And usually when I ask this question, the first question is, well, Microsoft, I can restore, right? Oh, that's an interesting question. Do you know? Do you know what level of recovery Microsoft offers on a default Azure subscription? Because the thing I've found when I go and talk to most organisations is you get that deer in the headlights look when you ask this question, because people simply aren't thinking about it. And these questions are critical if your organisation hosts some or all of your infrastructure in the cloud. And you think about a born in the cloud organisation. Okay, there are examples where someone has been an administrator of a born in the cloud organisation and they've had a falling out with the company who owns that subscription, and they've nuked everything. There has been examples, for example, where a founder has started up a subscription on their credit card, and then the founder has later been let go or fired, and then they've just stopped paying the bills, and the subscription's gone to put, because no one's actually thought, oh, wait a sec, no, this surely has all of this built-in backup and recovery. It does if you set it up. But most people never do. Azure provides built-in short-term backups for most of their workloads. So they do provide some level of sanity check. And it's usually, depending on what you're looking at, about 30 days. But in some cases, you've actually got to go and flick that slider across and turn it on. And I can't tell you how many organisations where I've gone in and looked and the slider isn't even turned on. And I go, so if you lost this database tomorrow or it became corrupted, do you know how to recover it? And it's like, can that happen? So here's another one that's interesting, right? SQL Server Management Studio, you can connect to an Azure database instance, an Azure SQL instance. Now, with some things, you can go and configure firewall rules to allow you in. However, there's a really interesting bit with that. If you are running a virtual machine inside Azure and you install SQL Server Management Studio, you can actually connect to, or you can attempt to connect to, any other Azure SQL instance that's running in Azure, because by default, the firewall rules allow anybody coming from inside Azure to make that connection. The same applies with virtual machines. So you can say, don't allow access to RDP except for these IP addresses and from within Azure. So you just spin up a separate subscription and then you can RDP across to it. Most people don't realise that one. Most backups are written to locations, however, within the same subscription. So if we go back to that question I was asking, if we go back to what would happen if an evil genie took over your Azure subscription and then cancelled it, most of your backups are sitting in their subscription. So you'd lose that. Or if someone's really trying to mess you up, they could just go through and delete all of those things and you wouldn't be able to recover them. And this is also coming back to the idea, how many people here know that the global administrator account on their Azure subscription is just whoever set the subscription up's Hotmail account? A lot of people are using their personal Hotmail account as the root account for the global subscription, which means that there are Azure global admin accounts that have turned up in Troy Hunt's Have I Been Pwned database. Because there's some people that have signed up for porn sites using the same account that they have as the root account for their Azure subscription. And if they're doing stuff like that, do you reckon they're using separate passwords? I don't. Backup to Azure is part of a comprehensive backup strategy, but you also need to get backup data out of Azure on a regular basis so that you can recover in the event that you have what's called a subscription loss scenario or a subscription dominant scenario. You need to get your data somewhere off-site, okay? Off-site has always applied with data. Who here has backups of Azure workloads that exist outside Azure? Hands up. Okay, a couple. Who here has backups of Azure workloads that exist outside of Azure and wouldn't be lost if the dev team's computers were stolen? That's very good, because there's a lot of people who are sitting there going, oh yeah, I've got a backup on my laptop. So we've got a copy of the Azure SQL database because I exported it to a backpack file. We're good. So if you lose your laptop, what happens? Oh, yeah, didn't think about that. So it could be as simple as exporting stuff, putting it on a USB drive and throwing it in a safe. But there are services that actually provide you with the ability to fully back up and recover most workloads that are running in your Azure subscriptions. Make sure you have off-site backups that include source files, configurations, and data. Back up your ARM configurations. So those of you who know how Azure works now with Azure Resource Manager, you can deploy the vast majority of your Azure infrastructure using an ARM template. So this is where you start. You have a backup of your ARM configurations. You have backups of your VMs, your data, and anything else you need to completely restore your environment to a new subscription if you need it. Now, data generally needs to be backed up much more frequently than configurations. Configurations, basically, this is what it looks like, and then you spin it up again, and that's what it's going to look like again. But your data is always changing. Services exist to back this up, and you can look into them. There's third-party services. The services built into Azure, some of them are okay, but some of them aren't. But there are services that you can get that can literally replicate, for example, VMs out of Azure and across to AWS. So that if you lost one subscription, you could spin it up in a competing subscription. Now, backups is important, and it's related to building your dev test environment. And I'll explain how in a minute. But let's not forget security. Many born in the cloud deployments have a single root account, which means that there's one account, a bunch of developers know the username and password, and they can all use it. Who here's got a friend who might have been in that situation? Right. Many born in the cloud organisations allow anybody to deploy to production. I have seen companies where I've gone in and everybody's a global administrator of the Azure account. There's no question. If you're working at the company and you are involved in development at that company, you can basically do whatever you want in the Azure subscription. That's how we end up with virtual machines that are running BitTorrent clients. Minimize who is able to deploy directly into production. And it becomes more feasible if you have a test environment, because what you can do is you set up your test environment so that developers can go and push into test, but then you've got a process about who can actually go from something that's been approved in test into production. But if you've got anybody that can deploy into production, it means that you are losing control of your production environment. Use what's called role-based access control to limit who can perform specific tasks. Azure allows you to lock this down on a per resource group basis. You can literally say, so-and-so can only access resources in this particular group. They're only able to spin up this particular resources. Minimize the number of people that can modify the configuration of the cloud servers. Get people out of your global admins group. Work out what they're meant to do and then restrict their permissions. This is a big one because there's a lot of organisations where everybody can go and do anything. Use Azure Privileged Identity Management. And when you turn that on, what happens is membership of any privileged group requires that you activate it and then you perform two-factor authentication. So you literally say, I want to go and create a new Azure SQL database. So you go into the Azure console, you say, I want this role. It'll then perform two-factor authentication on you. And then for the next hour, you can go and perform that task. Or you can even have it so that someone else has to review that and then approve it. When someone leaves your organisation, absolutely make sure that you lock out any accounts they have which have access to the subscription. The number of people that get fired by an organisation and then come in and then mess with stuff is really not trivial. Minimise the number of non-subscription related accounts, and by that I mean, for example, Hotmail accounts that have any permissions to the cloud environment. So when you spin up an Azure subscription, you can go and create Azure Active Directory accounts. So you'll have, for example, the root account, which might be a Microsoft account. Now, what you've got the option of doing is you can allow other Microsoft accounts access to the subscription, but what you're much better off doing is creating Azure Active Directory accounts and then getting people to log in via those, because then you can get rid of those accounts if those people leave, but you can also quickly enable things like two-factor authentication and then manage those accounts centrally. Provision Azure AD accounts for admin and dev tasks instead, and basically, if you've got a root account that's a Hotmail account, switch it so that that account is only used for that. It's not signed up for anything else. And then the password for that's sitting in a safe. And you only pull that out as a break glass resource. Make sure that the global admin account isn't someone's personal account. So how do you build a dev test environment? A dev test environment, as I said, is more than a developer's laptop. It looks like and functions the same as your production environment. And this is the cool thing about the cloud. An effective dev test environment allows you to figure out that something is wrong before your customers do. And you can use your disaster recovery strategy to build your dev test environment. So in the past, if you wanted a replica dev test environment, you basically had to go out and purchase a whole bunch of servers and make it look like your production environment. But in Azure, you can spin something up very quickly, use it, and then blow it away. And if you have a good, functional disaster recovery strategy that allows you to replicate your entire environment from backups, you can use that to recover to a separate subscription, perform your test, and then blow it away or figure out what you want to do with it. And it achieves two things. One, it verifies to you that your disaster recovery strategy works, that you actually are able to recover in the event of full subscription loss. Because if you can do that, then you can recover the little things. If someone accidentally deletes a couple of tables from a database, you can go and recover that because you know that you've got the big backup so that you can do all of the little recoveries. In the past, test was identical to prod and it required a lot of expensive infrastructure. So how would you rebuild if you lost your subscription? That is how you build out a replica test environment in the cloud. You go and put it in a separate subscription, and then you can control it in the same way, and you can allow people to work on that subscription, and if they break something, well, it's okay. It's a separate subscription. It's not going to bleed over into your primary production subscription. It also gives you the ability to control the spending costs on that subscription. You can get a good idea where you're not sitting there going, okay, is this a test environment or is it a production environment? Well, you know, test subscription, production subscription. Work towards building a test environment from ARM templates, app configurations, and recovered data so that you can actually spin that up and you can get to the point where you could automatically deploy that environment. If you can completely recover your production environment to a new subscription, you can use that technique to build a replica for test. It means generating extensive documentation about your environment. And who here loves documentation? One person. Excellent. If people didn't love documentation, or if people did love documentation, I wouldn't have a career as an author. That's one of the best things about writing books, is it's mostly because IT people and developers really hate the blank page. They like the blank screen, the blank page, not so much. So, documenting your environment, figuring out what you need to back up and recover also allows you to spot what the cruft is, the stuff that you no longer need, because you become very aware of what you're backing up and what you're recovering. So you sit there and go, well, that VM doesn't need to be here. That particular web app doesn't need to be there. That database doesn't need to be there, because I don't need to recover it to get back to where I need to be. And so you can use that as a method of cleaning out your subscription. You need to be able to automate the building and tear down of a just-in-time test environment. And if you can do that, you are absolutely golden. You don't need to worry about a lot of these issues, because you only need to spin up and pay for your test environment when you need it. Now, Azure Stack's coming, and it may be that you can push Azure Stack as your dev test environment. I've seen a lot of organisations that are very interested in this idea of having on-prem Azure for test, and then prod is out in Azure proper. And that is something that Microsoft's certainly looking at when it comes to Azure Stack, and we're seeing that go into trials at the moment. Operationalise your pessimism. That is, assume that something will go wrong and build procedures around stopping that going wrong. Anything that can go wrong eventually will. Don't sit there and go, well, we'll be fine. You buy car insurance because you're worried about having a car accident. You buy travel insurance because you're worried about something happening when you're overseas. Sit there and work out what is the weakness in your Azure subscription, or what is the weakness in your processes, and then go and deal with that. If you can back up and recover your entire cloud production environment, you can use that to build a JIT dev test environment. Oops-a-daisy, that's not what I wanted to do. Backups need to be off-site, and that means out of the cloud that you've got it hosted on. So make sure you've got off-site backups. Test environments form a block between deployment and oops, okay? Because you want to minimize the amount of oops that you have, and if you've got a test environment, you are going to minimize that. Now, at a certain level, if you're small, of course, there's less worry about oops. But if you're suddenly basing, other people's salaries on whether or not you hit oops, then that's something that you want to consider having. Not everyone in your organisation needs to be able to deploy to production. If you have the right structure and procedures in place, you can minimise the impact of inevitable problems. And there will always be problems. Nothing ever runs perfectly. Assume the worst and then enjoy the best. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.